My name is Dan Kittredge. I'm the founder and executive director of the Bionutrient Food Association, which is an educational organization whose mission is to increase quality in the food supply. And by quality, we're talking about flavor, aroma, health-giving attribute, nutrient levels, basically. And the correlation between food quality and soil health and human health, and any number of other systemic benefits. Basically, principles of biological systems. The idea is basically that nature evolved a very, very sophisticated system for symbiotic, growth, and that as farmers, the more we can work in harmony with it, the better off we're going to be. The healthier the plants will be, the lower the pest and disease pressure, the lower cost of production, better environmental benefits, etc. Why is that message important? For about 8 different reasons. For farmers, just from a practical standpoint of economic viability, climate resilience, etc., it just happens to be in your best interests from a very bottom line perspective. From the environmental perspective, building soil, increasing climate resilience, carbon sequestration, minimizing or totally removing any kind of negative effects of farming on the environment. That's part of the process. And then obviously for human health, what's in our food is what our bodies are built out of. And so if there's a lot of chemicals and not a lot of nutrients in our food, then we're going to be sick. And when you're working in harmony with nature and producing crops that are more nutritious, one of the end benefits is that your food can be medicine and you are better off and your family is better off by eating it.
All right. Thank you all for having me here. And John's actually quite a tough act to follow. He covered a lot of the basic points I was planning on discussing here in my first session today. I will just give you a quick background on myself and then hop right into it and see where we end up. So, as Nolan said, I'm from Massachusetts. I grew up on an organic farm. My parents have been running an organic farming organization since the 1980s. So I come from that smallholder, homestead, mixed operation, East Coast kind of perspective, which is a little bit different than I think most of the farmers out here. I believe today's presentations are supposed to be about more of the smaller operations and urban and things like that. So maybe that's why I'm on for today. Just as a quick sort of how did I get into all this stuff, I couldn't find a better lifestyle for raising a family than the one I had been brought up in on the land, farming, sort of the homesteadish kind of vibe. And I had been managing my parents' farm through college, through my 20s, and when I got married, realized that I didn't have the skills actually to make a living based on the economics that were occurring on my parents' farm. And I'd always been told that organic was better. We kind of always had our noses a little bit higher when we went to the farmer's market or wherever it was. We were just, superior people. But when I actually sat down and looked at it and tried to figure out why we weren't making any money, it became pretty clear to me that the reason we weren't making any money is because the plants were sick. And I like to oftentimes start my presentations with a bit of a visceral story about how it really hit me. We had an old farm dog named Stewball who was laying in the driveway one day sunning himself. His job was to chase coyotes and raccoons at night, keep them away from the chickens and the corn and everything else. He was sunning himself, and one of the CSA members, CSA is a community-supported agriculture, people give you money in the spring, and they come by and pick up a bag of veggies every week for 20 weeks during the growing season. One of the CSA members had driven into the driveway and not slowed down, and he hadn't gotten up, and he got his rear end driven over. Got ground into the driveway and got a cut, and no broken bones, no harm, no foul. He got to hang out in the house for a couple days, but at the moment of this story, he was back out on the driveway on his other side, sunning himself again. And I was just going to check on him and I'm not sure if anybody knows how nature cleans an open wound, but the flies had laid eggs, and the eggs had hatched, and those maggots were in there eating up the dead flesh. It's a pretty visceral kind of experience, and I had just had lunch and just about lost it all right then and there. But what really got to me after that was the fact that I had in my hand a 5-gallon bucket because I was going over to the potato patch to knock the potato bugs off the potato plants, because that's the only way we were able to keep the potato plants alive long enough to get something resembling a harvest. And we did that every 2 days all summer long, and I always had done, and that was just the way things were. And I stopped there, and it just really hit me that larvae eating my dog alive was a big shock to my system. But larvae eating my plants alive was a totally normal situation. And I got to thinking about it, and in nature, you don't really see plants being eaten alive by larvae. You don't really see a flesh-eating fungus coming through and taking out the plants. But powdery mildew, downy mildew, there's all kinds of fungal infestations we're all familiar with here. Nature has some system to functionally prevent that from occurring. And obviously, we were not accomplishing that on our farm. And so I thought maybe, using chemicals is not good, and so not using chemicals is better than using chemicals. I can, justify that rationale. But just because we weren't using chemicals does not mean we actually were producing healthy plants. And so I started looking into the question of what is better than organic. And this was in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, I think. And I started this process of reading books, going to conferences, attending seminars, in the wintertime, practicing techniques on the farm in the summertime, and in very, very short order, through still maintaining functionally organic protocols, like still being able to stay certified, through very simple and inexpensive changes of practice, got to a point where pest pressure and disease pressure disappeared. Yields went up, cost of production went down, shelf life went up, flavor went up, economic viability went up. And I was like, okay, I grew up on an organic farm. My parents run an organic farming organization. In 20 plus years of being in this community, I've never heard of a bunch of these things. So I think there's something here, and I think it needs to be talked about. And so that was what started me on this path of giving workshops and giving courses. And it's really just sort of spread from there into an organization that's got a decently, strong footprint across this country and, spreading around the world. And the way sort of we have positioned ourselves is to say, there's a high ground here where we can learn from all these different communities, learn from the permaculture community, learn from conventional ag, learn from agroecology, learn from organic. And the high ground that we've sort of said, can anybody disagree with, is nutrition. Your food should be nutritious. Can anybody disagree with the fact that your food should be nutritious? And we have a hard time finding people to say, no, your food shouldn't be nutritious. But the reality of the fact is that a lot of what we're producing is functionally not very nutritious. So I'm going to focus my conversation this afternoon more on the technical, logistical details of that conversation, of nutrient variation and testing and monitoring and market pressure and what's coming down the pike and what we're working on. Today, this morning presentation, I want to talk more about the basic principles of management. And this is part of why John's such a hard act to follow, because he basically covered everything I was supposed to be, or intending to talk about. So I'll, what do they say? Tell people what you're going to talk about, tell them what you, tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So I'll just try to repeat everything you said in my language, and maybe it'll provide some value. But the point of quality, of nutrition, of nutrient levels, nutrient density is a term that's sort of coming more and more to the fore, is really the background of all this. So when I teach my courses around the country, I call them principles of biological systems. And so there's a few basic points that we like to cover. We start off with the point that most plants are green, at least during the growing season. They cover their bodies with chloroplasts. Inside the chloroplast, the process of photosynthesis occurs. Photosynthesis is carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight equals sugar and oxygen. People are generally familiar with that. We're generally familiar with the fact that the oxygen is taken from the leaves and emitted into the atmosphere, and that's what we breathe. What we don't learn in school, and I think it was 9th grade science class for us, was that the majority of the sugar from plants in nature is injected, as John was saying, out from the leaves, through the stems, through the roots, and into the soil. And if you think about it from a sort of a strategic standpoint, nature's got this process where she covers plants in greenness to make stuff that are then injected out of the body of the plant, which is not a very efficient system if you think about plants being here and animals being there and fungi being here, et cetera. We learned about the kingdoms in school, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the fungus kingdom, and we were taught about them all being individual, which is pretty fraudulent, right? You cannot have a plant without a symbiotic relationship with microbes. You can't have an animal without symbiotic relationship with microbes. Anybody know what the % of cells in your body are that are human? Little factoid. Less than 10% of the cells in your body are human. 90+% of the cells in your body are bacteria, they're fungi, they're from other kingdoms. You know that you can't digest your food? Right? It's only the people inside of you that digest your food for you. Everybody's familiar with that concept? Yeah? I mean, we have to understand that it's an ecosystem function. We're ecosystems within ecosystems. That's the way nature evolved us to function. And this reductionist, mechanistic, soluble nutrient paradigm may be good for industry to sell products, but it's really not good for the environment. It's not good for the farmer's bottom line. It's not good for human health. There's a bunch of systemic dysfunctions that occur from that protocol. So I just want to open up the conversation about this. When you're born, there's nobody between your mouth and your rear end, right? The alimentary canal doesn't have anybody in it. There's this magical material that comes out of the mother's breast called colostrum for a calf or for a human or for a rabbit. It's a probiotic, it's a prebiotic, it's there to establish gut flora. Only when you have your gut flora established are you able to digest your food. This is foundational for animal function. Anybody ever been in a dairy barn where a calf didn't get its colostrum? Anybody ever had that experience? I've got a microphone on, so I won't do it properly, but it goes, "Ma!" Right? "Ma! Ah!" It's like a fire alarm, right? It just goes right straight down your spine. You can't think. You just get tensed. Nature's got an alarm system to tell you when something's wrong. We have this situation in humans where when you have a baby, my wife and I have 4 children, and people say, "Oh, you had a baby, you're not going to sleep for a year." My experience is that babies that actually get their colostrum, that get their gut flora established at birth, they nurse, they sleep, they poop occasionally, they might wake up and gurgle at you, and then they go back to sleep. Right? The process of a healthy baby's existence is a really peaceful existence. We understand at birth that a plant must have its colostrum established as well. Plants, just like animals, cannot digest their food. They have evolved a critical symbiotic relationship with microbes, and only when that microbial community is well established can they feed themselves. If you're in a car accident and you're in a coma and you're in the hospital and they, got to take care of you, you can be put on an IV drip, and you can be kept alive on an IV drip. Soluble nutrients injected directly into your bloodstream. And that's wonderful to be able to be kept alive in sort of a critical circumstance like that. But if you are on that IV drip for, say, 24 hours, all the people that live in the alimentary canal who aren't being fed anymore die off. And your digestion, shuts down. And then you got a big problem, actually, getting you off that IV drip and back onto food is where the complications start to happen. Fertilizer, by technical legal definition, is a soluble nutrient that is effectively injected directly into the bloodstream of a plant. When you add fertilizer to a system, you're short-circuiting the biological process. You're basically creating an environment where the microbes are no longer being fed, and you have a plant that is now effectively addicted to these soluble nutrients. It's really good for the people that are selling you products, but systemically, it's actually very detrimental for your bottom line, for biological system function, et cetera. So when I talk about growing plants, principles of biological systems, I generally say, I don't care whether you're growing an apple tree or an oat plant or a cucumber or garlic or an echinacea. What matters is what's the environment that they're growing in. It's the bottom of the food chain. It's the microbes that are actually the people we should be managing for. And when you create an environment where the microbes are able to flourish, your job as a farmer becomes much more simple. Your cost of production goes down, economic viability goes up. And so what I'd like to talk about during this 45 minutes from a primary standpoint is what are the environmental conditions to manage for so that the bottom of the food chain can flourish. So in my experience, I break it down to 5 basic components. The microbes need air to breathe, they need water to drink, they need food to eat, they need a few minerals to build their bodies out of, and they themselves must be present. So I like to walk you through what are some of the basic management strategies that you can engage in to create an environment where those dynamics are present. Air to breathe, water to drink, food to eat, some minerals to build their bodies out of, and that they themselves must be present. I generally say, you know, if you're going to take home one thing from my presentation that is the least expensive, least time-consuming, best bang for your buck strategy, I would say it's inoculation. So getting that colostrum to the babies at birth, to the inoculants, to the seeds at germination, in my experience, is one of the most efficient strategic things you can do. So if you're working on an ecosystem, in a farm, on fields, this is maybe a little bit different on pasture than it is on cropland, but you know, my experience is primarily on cropland when it comes to these techniques, that it may be less necessary on pasture. The logistics of applying inoculants, some people may be familiar with. If you've ever planted, you know, soybeans or alfalfa, oftentimes there's a bean and pea inoculant that is used. Anybody familiar with that? You've used bean and pea inoculant? Yeah. There's generally 2 species of microbes in that mix, Azotobacter and Rhizobacter. Doesn't really matter what they're called, but functionally they're the people that live in the nodule, in the plant root, who have the skills to pull nitrogen N2 gas out of the atmosphere and convert it into a form that's plant available. There's this other material also present in that bean and pea inoculant called molybdenum. Anybody ever heard of that one? Molybdenum? It's an element on the periodic table of elements. As I understand, there's 1 million pounds of molybdenum mixed into bean and pea inoculant and sold in this country every year. Anybody know why they use molybdenum in the bean and pea inoculant? You know? So the Azotobacter and the Rhizobacter, they're the microbes that have the ability to pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And nitrogen N2 gas has a certain structure. So the reason that molybdenum is added to the inoculant is because it's at the center of what's called the nitrogenase enzyme. The nitrogenase enzyme is the tool, like think about a 9/16 or a 1/2-inch socket or a Phillips head screwdriver or an Allen wrench. An enzyme is a biochemical structure tool that's used over and over again, like a 9/16 or a screwdriver, to put something together or to take something apart. And the nitrogenase enzyme has the exact size and shape necessary to pull nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and make it bioavailable. If you don't have the nitrogenase enzyme present, the Azotobacter and Rhizobacter can't do their job. You have to have the microbes and the minerals necessary for this biological process to occur. So I mentioned you need the life present, you need the minerals present, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that I found on our farm out on the East Coast, where it rains a lot and the soils are fairly heavily weathered, is that there's some basic minerals that are necessary for biological processes to occur, which are not present in sufficient levels in our soil. And I started out with remineralization with using some really, really simple materials like crushed up granite and sea salt to effectively address these mineral deficiencies. Now, I understand that out here it doesn't rain so much, and you guys have a little more, salt in your soil, so maybe sea salt is not something that's appropriate out here. But addressing some of these functional mineral deficiencies, I do believe is actually a really important piece of this puzzle. So the point I was making was about inoculation, not about minerals, but it is all beautifully interrelated. And as I understand it, if you do have a well-functioning biological system, there is a grand total of 1 pound of molybdenum necessary in an acre of soil for that nitrogen fixation process to occur. You think about a forest, there's not a lot of legumes in a forest. Nobody's adding nitrogen fertilizer in a forest. And yet the plants seem to be able to harvest and cycle all the nitrogen they need, even without legumes. And that's because in nature, all plants evolved with the functional ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere without the use of fertilizer. Not all plants have these nodules on their roots like the legumes do, but all plants do have the ability to work symbiotically with nitrogen fixers on their leaves or on their roots to pull nitrogen from the atmosphere, but that'll only happen if you have the nitrogenase enzyme present. Am I going too fast? Everybody's following? Sort of? Good enough? Just keep going. All right. So the point was about inoculation, and all I want to say is if you're conversant, comfortable with the concept of putting bean and pea inoculant on your legume seeds, that's all I'm suggesting. But that you actually get a much broader spectrum of species in your inoculant. At least 10 or 12 families of different fungi, at least a couple dozen different families of bacteria, and you put that on every single seed you put into the soil. Of course, if you're going to be having I guess they put fungicides on seeds. Anybody heard about that? Yeah, sorry. That's kind of counter to this whole process. So if you got a fungicide-coated seed, it's going to defeat the whole purpose. A fungicide-coated seed functionally creates an environment where there is no gut flora, and so you have a baby that doesn't get its colostrum that has to be fed from an IV drip from birth. A fungicide-coated seed is like antibiotics for your baby. Start them off on antibiotics so they don't have a good gut flora, so they're always going to not be able to digest their food, so that they're going to have supplements. Does that make sense? Anybody? I got one horizontal shake of a head. No? Think about it. When you are at birth establishing these dynamics, you are functionally breaking that biological pathway. You're creating an environment where the plants are going to be needing their fertilizer because they can't feed themselves otherwise. I know there's points about the seeds rotting and everything else, and that's why you say you have to put the fungicides in. There's a much longer conversation we can have about it, but I would suggest that nature does not use fungicide-coated seed. And there may be actually a systemic reason why it's detrimental and counter to a biological process. So anyway, a broad-spectrum inoculant on your seed, I think, is a really good strategy to be implementing going forward. It generally doesn't cost more than a couple dollars an acre, and really can help reestablish this functionality across the board. Let's talk about air, keeping air in your soil. I'm not sure how tight soils are out here. I use the metaphor, or I use the technique of my hand to assess aeration. I like to say, as far as I can reach my hand down into the soil without it getting too tight underneath my fingernails. Of course, you got to work it in a little bit, but the more you can reach your hand down, the more you should expect that there is sufficient air in the soil for the microbes to breathe. If you're down a half an inch and it's tight and hard, don't expect that there's air down 4 inches. And if you understand that the microbes in the soil need air to breathe, then air could be your limiting factor. How do you maintain air in the soil? How does nature maintain air in the soil? Growing up on a fairly small farm, we would plant garlic every winter, fall, October, November, you put the garlic in. Maybe people know about that. And we'd usually mulch it. And maybe we'd plant the garlic in an area where we just pulled fall carrots out of. And there'd be a big section of the field where we'd pull the carrots out of, and there'd be a smaller section where we put the garlic in for the next year. When the ground thaws out, snow melts, beginning of April, and the garlic's starting to come up. Usually for us in April is a fairly dry month. Oftentimes it's almost fire weather. It doesn't rain for a couple weeks, and wind starts to blow, and nothing's really growing very much. If you were to pull that mulch aside where the garlic is growing and reach your hand down, you would see, a soil covered with earthworm castings. You can reach down, you can pull up a handful of that soil, you can smell it, it's got a nice aroma to it. Directly adjacent to that, right where the carrots were growing last fall, but we didn't get any cover crops in, that soil will be tight, hard, cracked. You can't get your hands into it. There's no aroma if you can get it up out of the ground. So we have soil that had the same experience of winter, the same amount of snow, the same amount of freezing and thawing. And right here, it's actually soil. It's got aroma, it's got earthworm castings, it's loose, and right next to it is tight and hard. I would call that dirt. Where there's no life in it, I call it dirt. Where there is life, I call it soil. The only difference was that the microbes were able to be fed all winter long where it was mulched, and they starved to death where it was uncovered. If we can talk about Mother Nature, I think our first speaker today talked about that concept of Mother Nature. I like to say she's modest. Now, I don't know, I'm just speaking, but she likes to keep herself covered. She doesn't like to run around naked all the time. Where in nature do you see bare soil? Where? Desert? How well is nature doing in the desert? We have this idea that agriculture done well is a system where you can see soil or dirt. I would suggest, if nature doesn't do it, maybe we're violating her by doing that. If we think it's an appropriate protocol to keep soil uncovered because of whatever we've been brought up with our cultural traditions, with our practices, but it's in violation of what nature does, maybe we're wrong. From the perspective of the microbes, they don't fly to Florida in the wintertime and to stay on the beach. They stay right there in the garden, in the field. Where I grew up, we had a root cellar. We put our carrots and our beets and our potatoes in the root cellar. We had our garlic and onions hanging on, twine string. We had, meat and vegetables and fruit in the freezer. We had tomatoes canned. You put aside food for the winter because nothing's growing in the winter. And if you want to make it through till spring, you better have enough food put away. Now think about it from the microbes' perspective. There's no green leaves making sugar and injecting it into the soil during the wintertime. So how are they being fed all winter long? The only way that they can not starve to death is if there's food stockpiled for them on the land so that they can make it through till the spring. If it's the microbes that actually digest the soil and feed your crops, they have to be there and they have to be alive in the spring for that function to occur. Otherwise, you need to add fertilizer. So from my perspective, it's really, really simple. You got to have something on the soil through the winter to keep the microbes fed from a very practical standpoint. And cover crops, and especially polyculture cover crops, the more species you can establish, the better. It's obviously not efficient or practical in a multi-hundreds or thousands of acres farm to be mulching, right? That's just not efficient. If you're managing 2 acres and you're grossing $40,000 an acre, like we do out in the East Coast, well, you can afford to mulch, right? A couple round bales here and there, doesn't cost very much. But if you're operating on scale, you need to understand that it's a biological system. It's about creating an environment where the microbes are able to function and flourish and they need basically food all winter long. And if they have their food all winter long, that's what keeps the soil and doesn't have it turn to dirt. So keeping the soil covered as much as possible, I think, is a really foundational principle. And hopefully you understand, from the perspective of the biological system, it is actually food for the microbes. And so it's really actually critically necessary. And that facilitates aeration. Hydration, again, I'm assuming that on thousands of acres operations, you're not irrigating. So, the question is, how does nature facilitate this irrigation process? And this is something that I've seen on my farm, and I also understand in principle. But I think it's a really, really interesting insight. At least it's been a really powerful insight for me. If you go to the edge of the continent, on either side, there's this thing that happens twice a day where the water goes up and down. Has everybody heard about that one? Yeah? This magical power that the moon seems to have to cause water to go up and down. I just still don't quite believe it, but it happens. Seems pretty impressive. It's called the tidal force, right? As I understand it, tidal force does not just apply on the oceans. It applies on the continents as well. Now, I've seen this happen in my farm in a drought. We've got we don't have flat land. We've got hills and rocks and the occasional spot where you can grow crops. But right down the middle of my property, there's a seasonal stream. It doesn't run all the time. And, the past couple of years have been decent as far as rain's considered, but the previous 3 were pretty bad. We had 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks at a time with no rain or very, very little rain. And so that seasonal stream was not running. And I'd come out in the morning, and I would see it would be dry. And then I'd be out there at noontime, and I'd see that it was trickling. And then I'd be out there at, dinner time, and it would be dry again. And I'd see that. I go out there at various points in the day, because it's right in the middle of the field, of the farm. I'm walking back and forth. And it'll be dry, and then it'll be running. And then it'll be dry, and then it'll be running. And then it'll be dry, and then it'll be running. My understanding is that the water table below ground is affected by tidal force. And when the tides are high, basically that's pulling water from the water table up through the subsoil into the topsoil. And nature has this process of functionally watering our plants twice a day through the tidal force. Now that works really well, except for when you got a plow pan. Where you have subsoil compaction, if you get a penetrometer out, and you're good 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches, but at 8 inches, you've got 100 psi. Well, the tidal force can't pull through that. So if you've got subsoil compaction, then that functional process of nature watering your plants breaks down, and your susceptibility to drought increases dramatically. We know about the rippers. We know about the cover crops the deep-rooted cover crops that can crack open the soil. Maintaining that soil structure in the subsoil to facilitate hydration is a really, really potent piece of the puzzle. I understand you guys get 10, 12, 14 inches of rain out here a year on average. That's certainly not very much. So if you can take advantage of nature's processes to facilitate hydration, I think that's really going to be to your benefit. Just to put this all together, if you have the water and the water table being pulled up, the capillary action and the tidal force moving upwards, filling a lot of those pore spaces, it's going to be functionally pushing out of the soil the carbon dioxide that the microbes in the soil are breathing out, right? These microbes are aerobic. They breathe in oxygen, they breathe out carbon dioxide, just like we do. If somebody closed off all the air input and output of this room, after a few hours, oxygen levels will start to drop, and we'd have a hard time breathing. So when you've got this functional process going on, what's going on is the carbon dioxide is being pushed out of the soil into the atmosphere, where the plants are breathing it in, because they breathe in carbon dioxide, And then as the tidal force goes down, the oxygen that the plants are pushing out through the stomata into the atmosphere is being sucked back down into the soil. So think about it. Functionally, the earth is breathing twice a day. Breathing out, breathing in. Breathing out, breathing in. It's watering itself, it's aerating itself. Nature has designed a really, really, really sophisticated system here. And if we can figure out how to create a dynamic where that's allowed to function, my experience is that your cost of production goes down real fast. I don't use fertilizer on my farm. I don't use nitrogen. It's one of my rules. Nitrogen is for sissies, I say, kind of as a joke, but not really. I mean, people talk about compost in the organic community. Why? Where does nature pile up organic material, turn it, and then go spread it out? Indigenous communities globally, what was happening here in this continent 500 years ago, the math on how many pounds of beef were being produced in Iowa in 1491 versus the amount of pounds of beef that are being produced in Iowa now, if you convert corn and soy into pounds of beef, I mean, they were doing a better job than we are. And it wasn't just beef they were producing, there's a bunch of other stuff going on there also, right? If we work symbiotically with nature, functionally our cost of production goes down. So on a basic economic standpoint, our cost of production goes down. If your plants are healthier, all the better. So let me just talk about pest and disease resistance for a second. Pest and disease resistance, if there was a bale of hay sitting around one of these tables when you all walked in, you might have considered sitting on it, but I bet you would not have considered eating it. Fair statement? If somebody had walked a cow in here, that cow probably would not have considered sitting on that bale of hay, but she probably would have considered eating that bale of hay. Yeah? So we've got an example here of a situation where something is food for one organism, but not food for another. And we understand that cows have 4 stomachs, and they can digest cellulose and convert it into functional food, and we can't. Everybody's okay with that? Yeah? Who's okay with that? So different organisms have different levels of digestive system function, is the point. So, you know, going back to the Colorado potato beetles at the beginning of my presentation here, larvae, in general, across different kinds of insects, don't have livers like we do. Larvae don't have the enzymes in their gut to digest protein. They can digest amino acids, they can digest nitrates, but when those nitrates and amino acids get complexed into protein, that leaf becomes indigestible for the larvae, in the same way that a bale of hay is indigestible for us. So we're animals. We've got a more sophisticated digestive system than insects, than fungi, than bacteria. We're wired with a really sophisticated nutrient monitoring device, a couple of them, called a nose and a tongue. Anybody ever had a tomato from the grocery store in January? You know what I'm talking about? It looks like a tomato, right? They market it as a tomato, but you know what a tomato tastes like because you've been in the garden in August and you know what a tomato tastes like. You're an animal, right? Foundationally, they say we've lost our animal instincts. It's not true, we haven't. You know what a tomato is supposed to taste like, and you know what they call tomatoes in the grocery store and what they taste like. That variation in flavor is a variation in nutrient levels. Those compounds that correlate with flavor, plant secondary metabolites, they're called terpenoids and alkaloids and phenolics, and there's all kinds of really fancy names for them. They're big, complicated compounds. You can't build those in a plant until you build the fats and oils, the lipids. You can't build the fats and oils until you build the proteins. You can't build the proteins until you build the carbohydrates. There's this process of complexing of compounds that occurs in plants. And the more complex the compounds are, the more organisms can't digest the plant. So when you build a complete carbohydrate, your soil-borne pathogens, like the Rhizoctonia and Pythium and Alternaria and Verticillium, when you're building complete carbohydrates, those guys can't digest your plants. When you're building complete proteins, all the larvae can't digest your plants. When you're building complete lipids, fats and oils, all the fungal pathogens can't digest your plants. When you're building the secondary metabolites, the things that correlate with flavor and aroma for us, the beetles can't digest the plants. Nature is giving you a report card. When she's sending fungi to eat your plants, she's telling you this crop is fit for fungus. When she's sending insects to eat your plants, she's telling you this is fit for insects. Only when she's sending animals to eat your plants is she telling you this is fit for animals to eat. Right? Nature is talking to us, whether we want to believe it or not. Right? The signs are there for us to see if we're willing to be humble and to listen. And as far as I'm concerned, as a farmer, my job is to produce food. It's not to produce pounds. It's not to produce money. It's to produce nutrition. And we have, this is sort of my next half of my presentation this afternoon is what is nutrition and how do we test it and how do we correlate it and how do we apply market drivers to support people who are producing it. We're not trying to just produce more pounds of empty carbohydrates. We're trying to produce actual nutrition for us to flourish. So I've got 3 minutes left. Maybe I'll just stop and take 1 or 2 questions if there's any. Yeah.
When I go and eat an apple or a cucumber or something, assuming not just the surface, what percentage of those cells is the apple or the cucumber, and
What percentage of the apple or the cucumber itself is that plant?
yes,
The vast majority, I would say, because it's just the surface probably where most of the microbes are. Traditional communities, indigenous communities, engage in this process of fermentation. So if you've had yogurt or you've had sauerkraut or you've had sourdough bread, anybody familiar with Weston Price Foundation, Weston A. Price Foundation, there's a lot of really good literature that says that we should be pre-digesting our food, at least to a large degree, with microbes, and that's how indigenous communities did it. So just the apple itself does not have a lot of microbes on it, although it should have a nice spectrum on the surface. And when you irradiate it, I'm not sure if anybody wants to talk about FSMA and all the rest of that, but I got a big old fat problem with FSMA. When you take food and you fry it, you apply chemicals, you apply radiation to it, and you kill the microbes, then you have maybe the biochemical compounds, but not the life in the food. And so we really are doing ourselves a profound disservice by killing our food. Maybe just one last point here, if I haven't set everybody off yet with one of my sacred cow disturbances. Walking into the bathroom here today, I saw one of those big antibacterial soap dispensers, which is all of a sudden the in thing in the last 15, 20 years. Germs are bad. Like we've lived for a very long time with deep symbiosis with microbes. If you had an old growth forest, what's the likelihood that an invasive species is going to take it over? A. And if you clear cut an old growth forest, what's the likelihood that an invasive species is going to take over? Right? Just hold that in your mind for a second. You should have 150 different species living on your hand, right? And another 80 living in your armpit, right? You have evolved a symbiotic ecosystem with thousands of different species of bacteria and fungi on your skin surface and inside of you. This is nature. Let's just deal with it. It's not gross. It's actually vitality. This is symbiosis. This is how ecosystem function occurs. When you're walking into the hospital and you've got 150 different species on your hand, think of that as an old growth forest. Think of MRSA or VRSA as an invasive species. If you take the antibacterial soap and you do what you're supposed to do, and you engage in the clear cut, and you kill them all off, you have created an environment that is optimal for an invasive species to take over. You know how the MRSA and the VRSA spread in hospitals? You know about this? Right? And we have to really seriously think about the way we're engaging life in all these different ways. It's really not beneficial to apply insecticides and fungicides. It really does break a lot of these basic pathways. So, you know, what's exciting to me is that when you do manage for the environment, you manage for the environment where air is present, where water is present, where the basic minerals are present, which I didn't really talk about, where the microbes are present, life will take care of it. She'll do an amazing job. And from a basic economic standpoint, if most people here are growers, which it looks like a lot of people here are growers, and you know, paying the bills is what it comes down to, I would suggest that from an economic standpoint, it's in our very best interest to really, you know, question a lot of the foundational assumptions that are sort of being passed around here today. Or not here, but as part of the broader conversation. So on that note, I think I've run out of time, but thank you all very much.